Hey guys, welcome back to Teacher Love Club. So today's deep dive is going to be on mastering the art of springs. This is a highly requested sort of workshop dive, so we're going to get into it. So I'll just start by saying that probably everyone kind of knows this already, but sometimes the spring is heavier and it's harder, and sometimes it's lighter and it's harder, yeah? Pretty obvious, but we'll just go over a few different exercises where it may not be that obvious what it is, and also talk about the muscular work that's happening when the spring is lighter versus when the spring is heavier, and then also talking about springs in terms of the person themselves and what they might need. Okay, so let's start there. Let's talk about people and what they might need. So when someone's a little bit newer, I actually like to keep them a little tiny bit heavier on the spring. There's a few reasons for that. If they've come from more of a strength-based background, they're really used to lifting heavy weights and pulling fast and working with more effort. When we put them on something like a yellow spring or a blue spring, for an upper body based exercise, for example, they will pull really fast and not feel anything. So oftentimes newer clients who are doing something will say, oh, I'm not feeling anything. They want to go heavier and heavier and heavier. So I usually put them on a slightly heavier spring. I tell them to stay in a low kneeling position so they're not coming up to a high kneel and potentially falling forward. I keep them low or on a box and get them to go that little bit heavier so that they feel that burn a little bit more quickly and they're not wondering why they're not feeling anything, or the carriage is flying all over the place because they're moving too quickly. And then you're obviously going to instruct everyone to move at a slow controlled pace, keep tension on the straps so that they can actually feel that burn. Another thing to do with keeping the springs a little bit heavier for someone who is a new client is when you're doing something like a lunge. So at this moment in time, I'm on one yellow spring, which is a quarter spring. They're pushing it out and they're going to move really quickly, more than likely. So I want them to be on more like a medium spring, somewhere in between, not too heavy, not too light, just right, so that they can go into it, feel that little bit of pressure through that back leg, not too hard to get the back leg straight because the spring isn't too heavy. And then when they come in, they can pull the carriage in with a bit more control. When we're doing things like a standing side split and we're working those inner thighs, obviously I want them to go on that slightly heavier spring, so that half spring, blue spring tension rather than the yellow spring, so that they don't let the carriage fly out. Yeah, so it's slow and controlled and they can pull the carriage out and in with minimal sort of flyaway, minimal sort of chance of any injury. The other thing that you want to consider when you're working with clients is the BMI, so the amount of mass that the client has. If they are a smaller build client, they can go on a lighter spring and be okay. If someone has a slightly higher BMI, they are probably going to need a heavier spring to support their body. So I'll give you an example of that one. Say you're doing bridges, bridge 1, bridge 2, hip rolls up and down. You could do this for a challenge on something like a red yellow spring, so a full spring and a quarter spring. But if someone has a slightly higher BMI or they're brand new, I'm not going to put them on that spring. It's way too light. They need more support. They need the support for their lower backs, and they need the support so that they can actually feel their glutes and hamstrings activating when they're doing the exercise. Okay, so if I have someone who has slightly higher BMI, I'm going to get them on the heaviest spring for all of these exercises. So I'd say at least 2 heavy springs. I would even go as high as 2 heavy and a quarter spring for a bridge 1 and a bridge 2. And that doesn't include your bridge 3 or semicircle when you push the carriage out. You are still going to maintain quite a light spring there, but you could probably go up to, say, a red spring and a half a blue. But obviously we know semicircle bridge 3 is usually on like a red spring, one heavy spring. So that would be the same for things like a reverse lunge when I'm pushing the carriage out and in. With my newer client and or my clients with a slightly heavier BMI, so someone who is very small build, they can go on a very light spring and this is going to feel okay, yeah? But if someone has a slightly heavier build, I need to give them a little bit more support. So this is for men and for women. Someone who has a bigger body mass, more muscular mass, I'm going to make sure they're on a heavier spring just to start. So I'm going to go at least a half spring, a blue spring, maybe even 3/4. So maybe even a blue and a yellow, or popping the blue on the higher level if you have an Allegro 2 to make it a little bit heavier, just so they have that support in their bodies and they're not feeling like the carriage is going to fly in and out. So that's what I'm going to do for them. Now, in terms of your standing side split, it's going to be the same, okay? So slightly higher BMI, more muscle mass. I'm going to keep the spring a little tiny bit on the heavier side so that they don't have to push and pull so much of the carriage out and in. It's going to be exactly the same for your reverse planks, your presses with the carriage, your reverse knee tucks, your reverse pikes, yeah? I'm going to keep the spring a little tiny bit heavier. And then again, for more support, as I already spoke to earlier, I'm going to keep these springs a little bit heavier and tell them to stay in their low kneel position so that they can feel the muscles working. Yep, so a little bit heavier with the spring so it keeps the speed can be at a nice consistent pace for them without them feeling like they're going to wobble all over the place or they're not getting any work. Right, let's look at things where we're facing the front. The same thing, when I'm doing things on like a lying down double leg press or a single leg press, I'm going to probably maybe put them on a slightly heavier spring, just that maybe I'm going the 3 red and a blue rather than 3 red and a yellow, just so they really feel it, and then I'm going to offer to go a little bit lighter, yeah? It's really important just to keep checking in. So rather than sort of focusing on your clients who you see all the time and just leaving that person alone, you want to leave them alone to a certain extent so they don't feel like we're crowding them, but just be super aware of what's happening with their alignment. Keep checking their spring. So honestly, I cannot tell you the amount of times I've said, we're on 2 red springs and a yellow spring after being on a blue spring, for example. And I've been watching this new client and going, gosh, what's happening? And then I go over and they're trying to do bridge 2, bridge 1 on 1 blue spring. Or we've done double leg press and we're doing hands and straps now on a red spring and a yellow spring. And I come over and all their springs are on, or say 3 red and a blue or 3 red and a yellow, and they're on the wrong spring because I didn't check. So we want to give them space, but we also want to make sure that we are we're not hovering, but also very consciously aware of what's happening to their bodies, their alignment, are they safe, and what spring are they actually on. It's very important. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about sort of anatomy now, and a lot of us already know this, but it's good to have a refresher. When we're doing, we'll go back to the pressing out and in, profile leg work. Now, if the foot is to the edge and we're on a red and a yellow or a full and a quarter, this pressure with the foot to the edge is the most challenging. So foot to the edge, red, yellow spring, most challenging. I feel my outer hips, my glute med and my glute med. If I want to make it slightly less challenging for them, I'm just getting them to heel toe their foot out so it's not right to the edge of the machine. And then that is going to lighten the resistance. If I want to make it less challenging again, I'm obviously going to reach down and take off the yellow. Then I'd probably walk their foot back in and it's less challenging again. If it's still too much, I'm on just a red, so I've already taken off the yellow, heel toe the foot out again and go for that pressure. So that's your outer hip. Now, if I'm changing the spring and I'm going to my light springs, so let's say my yellow, my quarter, or my blue, which is my half, the most challenging thing to do would be to walk it out on a yellow and go from there. I'm working my adductors, my inner thighs, and the more I'm walking it out, because the adduction is the challenge, I have a lot more to pull in. If I want to make it slightly easier, quickly, I'm going to walk my foot. So it's the opposite. I'm going to walk my foot right to the edge. Then I'm going to push out, and then I have less of my adduction through my legs to pull in. So if it's out further, on the light spring, it is more challenging. I have to pull much more in, but if my feet are already closer together on that light spring, it's going to be slightly easier. Now, if I want to make it even less challenging, I'm going to go ahead and put on the blue and take off the yellow. So I'm going to go from a quarter to a half. And I would start with the foot out, and they're going, okay, that's still too challenging for me. If that's the case, then I'm going to walk the foot in on the blue, press in and out, and they might go, that's perfect, especially for your newer clients or your recently postnatal clients who might still have some sacroiliac instability, especially if they are still breastfeeding, because they will still have those relaxin hormones in their body. So when the spring is lighter, foot to the edge. When the spring is heavier, foot to the edge is easier. When the spring is heavier, foot to the edge is harder because you have to push out more, okay? All right. Now let's think about lunges for a moment. I am going to go back to my light yellow to blue. And the challenge on the light spring is when you are pulling the carriage in. There's a lot more that you have to think about for your stability and control in your body. There's less endurance in this one. When you're on a lighter spring, you can do a long lunge, and you have the capacity with the spring tension to stay in a long lunge the whole time. So right toes behind the foot bar, left foot to the closest shoulder rest, pressing the carriage out, straightening the left leg, leaning the body forward. Inhale, press the carriage out into a long lunge, and then slow motion, push into the heel and glide it in. I can stay in my long lunge position the whole time because I'm on such a light spring. If I were to do my lunges on a red spring or a heavy spring, which I can also do scooters on, it is very challenging to stay in the long lunge position the whole time. My glute med and glute min are so fired up, I would say to the point of overworking, just to keep the diagonal lean and just to keep my back leg straight. So whenever we're teaching a heavier spring lunge, it's important to start vertical. So there's like two different styles of lunge. Keep the back knee bent. They go into the lunge, they keep that knee over the heel, they straighten the leg, and then they come all the way up to a vertical position. This is going to take all of the tension out of their lower backs, okay? They're not going to get tension in their lower back because they're not trying to stay in this position. They're coming up to that vertical neutral. And if you're adding that into your lunges with the heavy spring, you can add extra layers, things like heel lifts, things like reaching. You can do a couple of scooters and then come all the way up, because we know that when we're on a light spring and we're doing a long lunge and we hold the lean forward, that is really challenging to hold the lean forward still, but it's possible. And also when you're on the lean forward, your core has to work harder. and also your glute actually works harder. Whereas when you're in more of a vertical position, so you're in the lunge, you're not there for too long, then you're vertical, or you're doing more of a 90 lunge on that heavier spring, probably standing on a box in this case, so I get the range. Because my body's vertical, I'm gonna get more my thigh rather than my glute. Now let's quickly look at something that lots of people find challenging when it comes to springs, and that is your sort of knee tucks and your knee stretches. So my suggestion when you're doing a knee tuck is lighter so that you can keep your body over your foot bar. So you can keep your shoulders over your wrists, over your foot bar. This will be, so knee tucking, walking the feet up because you're on a super light spring. I'm on a yellow spring here, a quarter. Knee tucking, you have to walk the feet up. And you are working predominantly your core and quite a bit of shoulders as well. Now, if I do a knee tuck on a red, which is absolutely possible, I don't have to walk my feet quite as far forward, but instantly there's actually less work in my core, more work in my shoulders so I don't fly forward over the machine. So when you're on a lighter spring, you are going to target your core more. When you're on a heavier spring in a plank and a knee tuck, you are going to target your shoulders more, okay? If you want to do a long stretch, a press out and in, your feet are against the foot bar, against the shoulder blocks, I'm sorry. You pull all the way in, shoulders past the wrist. Your legs stay straight and you move from the shoulders only. I'm on a red spring. It's quite a good strong one for the core and for the shoulders. If I go red, yellow, this is seriously powerful for my shoulders, less so for my core. Very powerful for the shoulders, the chest, and actually as I pull in, my arms are going into extension, I can feel my lats working, those big muscles in your back. Now, if I'm going to do knee stretches, I've talked about knee stretches a lot on Teach Your Love Club, but I will do it again. I'm going to go on 2 red springs or 2 red and 1 yellow. I cannot be here and do a knee stretch. See how my shoulders are over my wrists? My carriage bangs? I have to shift the weight back. My bum is back, my arms are on a diagonal, and then I push back. So it's not actually a core exercise. It is more thighs and glutes and shoulders, keeping them really, really stable, okay? So that is a nice little, I guess, a little bit extra something for you to think about with your springs. If there's anything else that you want me to talk about in the comments below or cover when it comes to springs, please pop them in the comments and I will see you on the next one.